before we go into the assembly process, we'll take a look at the underside of the block here, and we can see that everything's clean and ready to go. All the gasket surfaces are fresh. The main bearings have been installed. We can see a little bit here about the porting of the exhaust port there, and you can see this. The Ford has a very rough square edge there that Gary has cleaned out and made a gentle radius on there. The center port, we're limited by what we can do there because we have the two cylinders next to each other. And then we get another look at the exhaust port on the end there. Alright, now we're ready to go.
As Joe said, we're using a Max 1 cam. Hiskey Max 1 cam. We've coated the bearing surfaces with assembly lube, and we've coated the tappet surfaces with moly graphite type lube, and so the cam is all ready to install now. We've got the cam bearings in the engine and the gear bolted to the cam already. So we insert the cam.
Now what's important here while Gary's inserting the cam is we do this job carefully because the edges of the cam loops are sharp and can damage those bearings. So Gary's taking his time with this and slowly feeding it through the engine. This is more easily done with the crankshaft out of the picture, as we see here. The bearings have already been fitted. Great, and then we turn it over and make sure that it turns freely. Great. Okay, this is the crankshaft for our engine, and Gary, you want to tell us a little bit about it and what's important here?
This crankshaft we're using in this particular engine is the Scat 4 1/8" stroke with the 2-inch rod journals that uses the main Buick rod bearings. This one has already been polished, cleaned, and ready to install. One of the important things on a flathead, especially a used crankshaft, but even on a new one, is to remove these plugs that plug the oil galley. The way the flathead oiling system works, there's a 3/8" diameter hole drilled through the journal, and this plug plugs that hole. And in a used crankshaft, that all fills up with dirt and gunk from the old oil. And so when you regrind one, you need to take these plugs out and clean all that out. And after it's reground and cleaned, then you put the plugs back in to keep any dirt from getting in there.
Now those plugs, some of them are pushed in and some of them are threaded, right?
Some are drive-in plugs and some are threaded plugs, and you generally want to replace them with screw-in plugs if you can.
And even if you screw them in, it's not a bad idea to stake them with a punch or something.
To stake them or Loctite them. And a pipe plug won't come out if you do all that. But this one already has the crank gear installed, the slinger, and the screw back for the seal installed on it. So it's ready to install in the engine.
Okay, so now we'll get back to the installation shortly. Okay, Gary, we've got the crankshaft in place, the rear seals in place. We've got the cam gear and the crankshaft gear are meshed in the proper position. Now we're going to put the main caps in place, and we're down to putting the last of the studs in, right?
That's right, Joe. We lubed the end of the studs with oil where they screw into the block, and the reason we put the studs in after we put the crank in is it reduces the chance of accidentally nicking the crankshaft with the sharp edge of the studs. And once we've got the studs installed, then we install the main caps. And the front main cap has the front section of it is just a little bit longer, and it goes on the front section. The center main cap, as we mentioned before, is the heavy-duty steel unit, which is a good insurance for a blower engine. And the rear main cap is wider than the rest, so it's quite easily to tell which one goes there. And it's also the thrust surface. We lubricate the bearing surface with Cleveite bearing lube, and we lubricate the thrust surface with a lighter oil, so you can more easily check your end-to-end clearance.
Just a couple of comments here, Gary. Normally in a stock Ford, the front and the center main caps are very similar, so you have to look carefully for any differences there. And I noticed that you've put a little arrowhead here so that there's no chance that the thing gets put on backwards, which it could be if you didn't put that arrowhead.
Right, the caps will actually fit backwards, but they won't fit properly. And the arrow is just a little added assurance that you get it on right. And the threads for the nuts we lube with moly lube, which makes them torque a little closer,
More consistent.
more consistent.
And you get a true retention torque rather than any effects of friction.
Right.
And I should point out that Gary has installed a couple of bolts and washers on here temporarily, and that's so that the rear seal holder, which was installed with a little silicone on the back, seats down properly and then those bolts will be removed.
Right, the bolting the main bearing on the rear in most engines also retains the seal, but on the Flathead the seal is retained in the oil pan, and we won't be putting the oil pan on for a little while. And so if you don't do that, the silicone will set up without the seal retainer fully seated in the groove.
Got it. Now we got the washers in place, and that's an important part there as far as the torquing process. And these are ARP studs and nuts and washers.
Especially with a blown engine, there's so much stress on the crankshaft. Studs are a really good idea, and the next best thing to that is an ARP heavy-duty bolt.
Main bolt.
Main bolt.
Okay, at this point we've run the nuts down on the studs, and Gary's going to give them a little tweaky with the just to make sure everything's seated properly, and then we'll one for good measure there. Now we'll proceed with the torquing of the mains.
With the ARP studs, we torque them to 95 pounds with the moly lube.
Did you do that in stages, Gary? Torquing those?
I snug them up first to make sure they're seated completely and snug, and then torque them to the final torque. Now we're all torqued into place there, so
What's the next step?
the next step
Check and see how it rotates?
will be to check and see how it rotates, and then the next step will be to install the pistons.
Alrighty. Do we, and we've already checked to make sure it has the proper front to back end play?
Oh, we'll be checking that also.
Okay. Okay, Gary, it looks like we've got the crank in place, the main cap's installed, and we give the crank a little twist to make sure that that everything turns freely and as it should. And then we do a double check down here, and we make sure that the dots are lined up. There's a little hole on the cam gear and on the crankshaft gear. Make sure they're aligned, and they are. And then the next thing, we'll check for end play of the crankshaft. And we use that with a dial indicator.
Pry the crankshaft one direction and 0 the dial indicator, and then pry it the other direction, and we have about 7 thousandths.
7 thousandths, so that should be just right. Okay, and then the next item, we got our timing cover, and we've installed the gasket with just a dab of silicone on the back side, and then we've oiled the front side here, and so it's ready to go on. And we just put a dab of oil on the seal surface. We did not soak that seal.
And since we have the crankshaft in already, we have to compress the seal against the crankshaft to get the crank to seat in there.
And while Gary's giving that initial tightening, there's a little tool he made here for rotating the crankshaft that you can put a square drive on there to make the crankcase crankshaft easy to rotate, which we'll do when we're putting on the pistons. Okay, then next we'll do the install a piston and ring and connecting rod assembly, correct?
Correct.
And then when Gary will show you how to do that, then we install the pistons.